How truth outstank tyranny in the suburbs. The morning had started out deceptively perfect, sunlight filtered through the trees like golden silk. They are laced with the scent of mint, rosemary, and fresh earth. Birds chirped in delicate harmony, and the soft babble of the nearby fountain created a peaceful soundtrack to what should have been an uneventful weekend. But that illusion shattered the instant a blood-curdling scream pierced the calm, as sharp and jarring as shattered glass. Karen, Queen Bee of the HOA, the woman who wielded bylaws like swords and considered herself the patron saint of suburban enlightenment, was hurtling across HOA's garden in a drenched white robe, trailing cucumber slices and splashes of essential oils like a deranged spa ghost. Her shriek, "It got in my hair," echoed like a siren through the once tranquil landscape. Behind her, a battalion of bewildered spa guests in identical robes stampeded through HOA's meticulously cultivated heirloom tomato rows, overturning massage tables, trampling lavender plants, and dragging with them a storm of glitter, eucalyptus, and unchecked entitlement. And in the eye of the chaos stood the silent defender show as skunks, wide-eyed and puffed, their black and white tails raised in what could only be described as nature's version of DEFCON 1. This madness hadn't sprung from nowhere. It was the rotten fruit of a single decision. HOA had trusted someone, specifically her neighbor Jonah, to watch over the acre of federally licensed wildlife rehab land tucked at the edge of the neighborhood while she attended a wildlife conservation symposium out of state. Skunks weren't just a hobby for HOA. They were her mission, her healing, her life's work after the trauma of losing her brother, also named HOA, to a chemical accident while working in environmental research. The garden was sacred, but Karen didn't respect sacred. Karen, in her wide-brimmed hat and fox European airs, thought herself above fences, laws, and signs that said, in bold red letters, "Protected habitat, do not enter." She never asked permission. She simply decided. On Saturday morning, according to Jonah, who could barely recount it without wheezing with laughter, Karen had stormed onto the property flanked by yoga instructors, massage therapists, and guests she'd summoned through a neighborhood app. Claiming HOA had given her verbal approval, she waved around a clipboard filled with names that may as well have been written in crayon and barked orders like a cult leader on a retreat. "It's a community wellness initiative," she had declared, positioning hot towel buckets on HOA's rosemary bushes and setting up a facial steam tent that pumped fog over the skunk dens. The scent eucalyptus, peppermint, lemongrass was in assault, and it was this olfactory barrage, combined with the invasive foot traffic and screeching Namas chants, that triggered Pepper, the oldest of HOA's rescues and a retired therapy skunk with a history of being sensitive to sudden noise. Trail camera footage later confirmed it. The moment a spa guest placed an open jar of peppermint oil next to Pepper's den, the old boy raised his tail in a slow, deliberate warning. But the warning went unheeded. Karen, mistaking Pepper for a raccoon with a fashion statement, grabbed a broom and swung it like she was Moses parting the Red Sea. Pepper fired. The result? Cataclysm. Karen, her blonde updo now streaked with OD justice, flailed like she'd been struck by lightning. Guests slipped on crushed mint. One woman fell into the koi pond clutching a jade roller, and another tried to hide behind a compost bin only to be gently sniffed by a second skunk named Marshmallow. It was surreal. By the time HOA returned Sunday evening, the garden looked like a battlefield, its stone tiles overturned, solar lights shattered, and a handwritten sign that once read "Heal with nature" lying face down in the dirt like a fallen soldier. Karen, now the color of spoiled milk and still faintly reeking despite what must have been a dozen chemical showers, had already left 5 voicemails threatening legal action. HOA listened to them all while staring at her devastated mint bed, her stomach twisting with a fury she hadn't felt since her brother's funeral, because this wasn't just about property damage. This was about being violated, trampled, and dismissed in the one place she'd created to feel safe. Karen had come in with glitter and gongs and left behind destruction cloaked in entitlement. And now she dared to paint herself as the victim. No, HOA wasn't going to let her rewrite the story, wasn't going to let her weaponize her perfume-soaked tears to turn the neighborhood against the truth. She stood in the wreckage of her garden and whispered to Pepper, who waddled over and nuzzled her ankle with gentle loyalty, "We're not backing down. She started this. We'll finish it. Because some wars are fought with laws and letters, but others are fought with truth, tenacity, and a tail cocked just so." By Monday morning, the scent of lavender lace shame still clung to the air like a ghost that refused to leave, and the gardens, a sanctuary of balance and healing, sat in solemn disarray. Hoa spent the day silently restoring what she could. The rosemary bush, flattened like an old rug, would take months to regrow. The solar lights were beyond repair. Pepper, Marshmallow, and the others remained understandably skittish, peeking out from their dens only when the breeze carried no trace of perfume. But the real damage wasn't just botanical. It was psychological, emotional, personal. Karen had trespassed, vandalized, and then doubled down with delusional self-righteousness. And if Hoa had thought the spa invasion would mark the climax of Karen's suburban reign of terror, she was woefully mistaken. The real war hadn't even begun. It started with whispers. Neighbors who used to wave warmly began to look at Hoa with thinly veiled curiosity, some with suspicion. By Tuesday, an anonymous post had appeared on the neighborhood forum with the subject line "Concerns about skunk sanctuary safety." Hoa knew it wasn't anonymous at all. It was Karen, thinly veiled behind a fake name and wrapped in concern-trolling language like, "While I support nature, what about our children? And isn't it unsanitary to harbor wild animals so close to homes?" Within hours, the post was gaining traction, commented on by well-meaning parents and bored retirees who had nothing better to do than gossip between home meetings and bunco nights. Hoa didn't respond, not yet. She was gathering her ammunition, real evidence, real laws, real facts. Because this wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a campaign. A campaign to discredit everything she had built, everything she had protected, nurtured, and defended since she first broke ground on the sanctuary 3 years ago. Spurred by grief and love and the unshakable belief that healing didn't just come in hospitals, it came in quiet places, with soft paws and patient eyes. By Wednesday afternoon, things escalated. An official-looking letter arrived, adorned with the whole letterhead and signed by current chairwoman of community standards as well as 2 other board members Hoa had never even met. The letter demanded that all skunks be removed from the property within 10 days, citing health concerns, community risk, and aesthetic violations. Stapled to the back were 3 grainy black and white photos, one of Karen mid-scream, slipping in the mint patch, another of a guest's foot stuck in a compost pile, and a final one, blurry and zoomed in, of Pepper standing near a tipped-over bottle of peppermint oil. It looked more like a page out of a conspiracy theorist's scrapbook than official Hoa documentation. Hoa laughed so hard she startled Marshmallow, who immediately dove back into his den. Still, laughter didn't solve everything. That night, Hoa stayed up past midnight compiling her response. She attached her federal wildlife rehabilitation permit, state licensing documents, veterinary reports, and even a copy of the local ordinance that explicitly permitted the maintenance of registered wildlife habitats under residential care. She CC'd every Hoa board member and included a gentle reminder that trespassing into protected zones, especially ones clearly marked with signage, was not only unethical, but punishable under state law. Karen responded within an hour, this time more frantic, more unhinged. She accused Hoa of running a biohazard skunk farm and endangering public health. She referenced olfactory terrorism and made vague claims that one of her spa guests had developed perfume trauma and couldn't enter Bath and Body Works without flinching. Then, just as Hoa was rolling her eyes, the doorbell rang. Animal control. A tired-looking man in a tan field jacket stood on her porch, clipboard in hand, offering a polite but weary smile. "We received a report," he said, scanning the yard with the gaze of someone who'd seen too many angry geese and improperly housed iguanas in his career. Hoa invited him in. She showed him every enclosure, every medical log, every rehabilitated skunk. Pepper waddled out to greet him and even sniffed his boot. Halfway through the inspection, the officer crouched beside Daisy, one of the younger rescues, and sighed. "This is not what I expected," he admitted. "We thought it was a rabid raccoon situation." The woman who reported this said it was like a chemical testing lab for wildlife. Something about weaponized skunks. Hoa handed him the documentation folder, and he flipped through it, nodding slowly. "Honestly," he said, chuckling, "this is the most regulated backyard I've ever seen. Mind if I take a few pictures?" She nodded. He snapped photos, pet Daisy again, and paused at the gate before leaving. "Off the record," he said. "That woman, she smelled like a candle store exploded in a swamp. Maybe suggest a new brand." Hoa smiled politely, but inside, Her blood simmered. Karen wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just about embarrassment anymore, it was about control, power, and narrative. Karen wanted to win the neighborhood back by erasing the truth, but she hadn't counted on one thing: that HOA was ready to fight, not with lies or theatrics, but with calm, calculated defiance. The next morning, HOA printed every message, every screenshot, every camera clip. She collected witness statements from Jonah, from a former board member who had once called Karen a walking HOA hazard, and even from two neighbors who had watched the spa disaster unfold from their porch with popcorn. She submitted the entire packet to the HOA's disciplinary review committee, and then she called her attorney. Because Karen may have thought she could stomp into a protected sanctuary in designer sandals, terrify a pack of peaceful animals, and rewrite history with essential oils and fake clipboards, but she had no idea who she'd just picked a fight with. HOA wasn't just defending her garden anymore, she was defending her legacy, her brother's memory, the right to exist in peace. And with Pepper beside her and a stack of legal ammo in hand, she wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. By the time the whole board grudgingly scheduled a formal disciplinary hearing to review HOA's complaint and Karen's delusional accusations, neighborhood felt like it had been cleaved into factions. On one side were Karen's loyalists, mostly her yoga friends who still reeked of eucalyptus and denial. A couple of overly involved board members who owed Karen favors from some past muffin-related bribery, and the ever-present Frank and HOA diehard who supported any cause as long as it came with laminated flyers. On the other side were the quiet sympathizers, reasonable neighbors who had watched Karen unravel for months and were quietly rooting for Hermione and Yoda finally hold her accountable. And then, of course, there was the third camp, the spectators, the ones who treated the entire debacle like live theater, bringing popcorn to whole meetings and placing bets on Karen's next meltdown. It was absurd. It was exhausting. But HOA had no intention of backing down. Not when Karen had the audacity to twist reality until it fit her fragile ego, not when that twisted reality threatened everything HOA had spent years nurturing with her own hands and heart. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening, in the multi-purpose room of the neighborhood clubhouse, a room usually reserved for potlucks and baby showers. That night, every folding chair was filled. The tension in the air was thick enough to spread on toast. HOA walked in with Cheryl, her attorney, a calm, sharp-witted woman who had once sued and HOA over a flamingo lawn ornament ordinance and won. She carried a binder thick enough to break a toe if dropped, filled with documentation, wildlife permits, timestamped footage, witness statements, and legal precedents that made Karen's perfume trauma claim look like the punchline of a stand-up routine. Karen, of course, was already seated in the front row, wrapped in a silky scarf like a woman preparing to give testimony about surviving the apocalypse. She clutched a manila folder like it contained state secrets and glared at HOA with all the subtlety of a soap opera villain. Douglas, the HOA chairman, always looked vaguely startled, like he'd been woken from a nap just moments before speaking, called the meeting to order. Karen went first. She stood, cleared her throat dramatically, and launched into a 10-minute monologue that included phrases like emotional warfare, aromatic assault, and, inexplicably, botanical terrorism. She waved around a dry clean spa robe that still smelled faintly of skunk, holding it aloft like it was a tattered flag from some suburban battlefield. She claimed that HOA Zoo had destroyed her guests' mental health, left one instructor in therapy, and driven down community property values by releasing unregulated fumes of uncertain origin. At one point, she teared up as she described how she could no longer use her favorite patchouli-infused facial mist without experiencing flashbacks. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone in the back coughed in a way that suspiciously resembled a snort. Then it was HOA's turn. Cheryl stepped forward and, without so much as a flinch, laid out the facts. She opened the binder like it was a spell book and summoned evidence with each page. Printed screenshots of Karen's social media posts bragging about the pop-up spa party, clear video footage of Karen trespassing, toppling over a skunk deterrent sign, and ordering guests to ignore the wildlife stuff. There was even a glorious slow-motion replay of Karen slipping on a patch of wet mint, arms flailing like a scarecrow in a windstorm. As Pepper waddled past her with casual disinterest, the room was silent, transfixed. Even Douglas blinked a few times, as if his brain was buffering. Cheryl concluded with a simple, devastating question. If this had happened in your own backyard, would you remain silent or would you defend what you legally and ethically built? Karen tried to object. She stood again, launching into another dramatic appeal, insisting that as a community leader she was only doing what was necessary to maintain harmony. She claimed the skunks were still a danger, that they were emboldened now and training for further attacks. Her words were unraveling. She spoke faster, her pitch rising, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for support she no longer had. It was painful to watch, but Hoa stood still, arms folded, calm and unmoved. She didn't need to say anything. Karen was detonating her own credibility in real time. The board recessed for deliberation. Neighbors buzzed in whispered conversations. A woman named Judith leaned over and whispered to Hoa, "She once tried to throw a silent disco in my garage without asking." "You're a hero." Joan arrived late, holding a tray of brownies and whispering, "Did I miss the fireworks?" Hoa smirked. "They're just getting started." When the board returned, Douglas cleared his throat and read the decision. It was unanimous. Karen had violated multiple community regulations, including trespassing, unauthorized use of private property, and interference with protected wildlife. Her request to revoke Hoa's rehabilitation license was denied outright. Instead, Karen was issued a formal citation, ordered to pay restitution for property damage, and most satisfying of all, suspended from organizing any Hoa event for the next 12 months. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Douglas silenced her with a firm, weary, "Karen, this meeting is over." It should have been the end, but Karen was not the type to accept consequences quietly. The next morning, she emerged on her sidewalk with a folding table, a stack of homemade flyers, and a new campaign, "Stop the Skunk Sanctuary." She sat beneath a hand-painted pastel banner, sipping herbal tea and glaring at passing cars. The flyers accused Hoa of harboring feral beasts, creating a natural gas hazard, and indoctrinating children into skunk worship. Only 3 people signed her petition that first week. 2 she bribed with gluten-free muffins, and 1 was her cousin from Tampa. Meanwhile, Hoa's garden slowly began to heal, and the neighborhood began to laugh again, because they had seen the truth with their own eyes. And as it turned out, truth smelled a whole lot better than desperation mixed with compost tea and failed power grabs. If Karen thought being publicly humbled and benched from the HOA's event roster would douse the wildfire of her crusade, she had vastly underestimated her own capacity for delusion. She didn't retreat, she regrouped. By the end of the week, her sidewalk campaign had morphed into what the neighborhood now jokingly called the Skunk Watch Ministry. Every morning, like a doomsday prophet with a spa budget, Karen set up shop under her pastel canopy. She wore her oversized sunglasses like armor, passed out incense sticks like pamphlets, and cornered joggers with dramatic monologues about the unchecked rise of backyard biohazards. She clutched photoshopped images of red-eyed skunks bearing fangs, claiming Hoa's rescues were mutating due to overexposure to peppermint oil and plotting a coordinated territorial uprising. If it hadn't been so ridiculous, it might have been sad. But Hoa knew better. Karen wasn't just spiraling, she was strategizing. What she lacked in facts, she compensated for with noise. And noise, Hoa had learned, could be dangerous when left unchallenged. So she did the one thing Karen never saw coming. She turned Karen's narrative into a spotlight and stepped directly into it. With the neighborhood still buzzing from the hearing full out, Hoa quietly began planning an event of her own, Wildlife Wellness Day, Healing with Nature. It would be everything Karen's fox spa disaster was: legal, educational, professionally supervised, and entirely centered on respectful coexistence with urban wildlife. She secured permits, rallied volunteers, and even invited local environmental educators, wildlife officers, and school teachers. There would be animal care demos, DIY planter stations for kids, booths for eco-conscious businesses, and supervised viewing enclosures for the skunks. It wasn't just damage control. It was a declaration: you don't get to rewrite the truth with fear and flyers. Not anymore. As the event drew near, Karen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began warning neighbors that Hoa was forming a nature cult, and that their children would be brainwashed by skunk propaganda. One Facebook post even accused Hoa of using neurological scent conditioning to win public favor, whatever that meant. A neighbor named Don created a meme of Karen sniffing the air with the caption, "Smells like paranoia and peppermint." The post went viral in the community group. Meanwhile, Hoa stayed focused. She wasn't planning a spectacle, she was planting a seed. One that could grow into something bigger than drama. Understanding. The day of the event arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself was backing HOA's efforts. The garden rested and radiant welcomed neighbors with soft music, informational signs, and the hum of hopeful energy. Children giggled as they got their hands dirty planting lavender and bee balm. Parents chatted with wildlife experts, some asking sincere questions about urban coexistence. A food truck offered organic snacks and lemon spritzers. And at the heart of it all, Pepper lounged in his glass-paneled enclosure, perfectly content under the shade of his newly rebuilt den. His presence wasn't just symbolic, it was sacred. He'd become more than a skunk. He was a survivor, an educator, a four-legged reminder that not everything different is dangerous. And then, right on cue, Karen arrived. She marched in like a disgraced monarch trying to reclaim her throne in safari jumpsuit, wide-brimmed hat, and the ever-present clipboard clutched like a divine tablet. She didn't register at the welcome table. She didn't smile. She walked straight into the heart of the event and began peering into booths with the scrutiny of a health inspector on a power trip. At the wildlife license display, she barked, "Who authorized this?" A teenage volunteer calmly replied, "The whole board and the State Department of Wildlife." Karen scoffed and moved on, circling the skunk viewing area like a shark in Chanel. When she reached Pepper's enclosure, she tapped the glass sharply and declared, "This is animal cruelty. You've turned them into sideshow freaks." A staff member gently explained the animal's comfort was constantly monitored, and the enclosure was designed specifically for rehab. Karen ignored her and turned to the crowd. "You're all being tricked," she cried. "These animals are dangerous. This is a PR stunt to distract from the fact that I was attacked right here in this garden." Ho stepped forward, microphone in hand, calm, composed, and shaken. "Karen," she said gently but firmly, "you're welcome to enjoy the event, but please don't frighten the children or the animals." Karen's face contorted, her voice rising. "This is not over. You're going to regret humiliating me." But before another word could escape, nature intervened with divine timing. A gust of wind tore an informational banner loose from its hook. It whipped through the air and slapped Karen full in the face. Her hat flew off, her clipboard clattered to the gravel, and in her startled attempt to recover, she stumbled backwards directly into a tub of compost tea, used earlier for a soil health demo. The splash was glorious. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Kids giggled, parents chuckled, and even Pepper lifted his head, as if aware that justice had once again been served by wind and worm castings. Karen stood soaked, steaming, and speechless. She looked at Ho like she'd summoned the weather herself. But Ho didn't need to gloat. She turned back to the crowd and smiled. "Thank you all for being here today," she said. "Let's keep learning and laughing." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and volunteers packed up tents and signs, Ho sat on her porch with Pepper nestled beside her. They watched the wind carry away the last traces of chaos. The event had raised enough to fund a new habitat enclosure, gained half a dozen new volunteers, and planted something else addressed. Karen's flyers, gone, her clipboard, likely drying next to a washer full of compost-soaked couture, and the neighborhood, it had seen through the noise. Truth didn't need to shout. It just needed room to grow. The neighborhood, in the wake of the compost tea incident, felt lighter, as if a fog had finally lifted. Kids resumed waving at Hoa as they passed her garden. Neighbors, some of whom had once hesitated to speak out, began stopping by with kind words, questions about the skunks, and even homegrown herbs as peace offerings. The skunk sanctuary, once a flashpoint of tension and rumor, had transformed into a place of quiet fascination and cautious admiration. But while the community gradually embraced the truth, there was one person who refused to. Karen. She had gone quiet. Yes, but not because she had surrendered. Silence in her world was never resignation. It was strategy. She'd retreated into her house like a general licking wounds after a failed siege, her curtains drawn, her porch once adorned with pastel banners now bare. But Ho wasn't fooled. She knew Karen too well. And her instincts were confirmed late one Wednesday night when her inbox pinged with an email so absurd, she almost thought it was a prank. Subject line: urgent. Whole leadership change proposal, community support needed. Sender: concerned resident at neighborhoodvoice.org, which, naturally, was Karen under a new alias. Hoa stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. The email, though written in the stiff, clinical tone of a badly disguised amateur politician, was unmistakably Karen. She accused the current board, particularly Douglas, and two others of failing the community, claimed that biohazards were being allowed to flourish unchecked, that wellness and safety were being compromised by inaction, and most galling of all, that she was the only one with a vision strong enough to protect the neighborhood's values. Attached was a proposed ballot of new candidates. Her yoga instructor who once tried to hide behind a compost bin, her massage therapist who blamed skunk spray for her migraines, and one particularly at inclusion, her cousin Tanya, who didn't even live in the state but had allegedly consulted remotely on HOA reform. It was Karen's final gambit. If she couldn't win through shame or spectacle, she would try to reclaim power through bureaucracy. HOA read the email twice, then calmly shut her laptop. She could have ignored it. Most people did. Karen's campaign had lost credibility the moment she fell into the compost bin. But this was about more than just skunks now. This was about truth, about boundaries, about every person who had ever been steamrolled, shouted down, or manipulated by someone who mistook arrogance for leadership. Karen wasn't running to serve, she was running to reassert control over a community that had already outgrown her. So HOA made a choice, a bold one. She stepped out of the shadows and into the arena. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, HOA submitted her name for an open HOA liaison position, specifically the seat for environmental and property boundary oversight. It was a role Karen had often dismissed as a checkbox for nature nerds, but now, it had teeth. The announcement was made on the neighborhood forum that weekend, and the shift was immediate. Conversations erupted not just about the upcoming vote, but about the future of the community itself. HOA wasn't flashy. She didn't campaign with incense or handouts. She didn't host meet and greets or promise glittery events. What she offered was something rarer: calm integrity. She posted a single statement on the forum, outlining her experience with wildlife rehabilitation, her respect for property rights, and her belief that a community wasn't built through fear, it was built through trust and truth. The post ended with a line that stuck with everyone who read it: nature doesn't need to be feared. It needs to be respected, and so do our neighbors. Karen, predictably, exploded. She accused HOA of weaponizing sympathy, of politicizing animals, and even claimed HOA was manipulating children by letting them fall in love with vermin. On election night, Karen showed up to the open forum in a beaded blazer and a name tag that read "Your future, your voice." She spoke with frantic urgency, warning the crowd of an underground wildlife cabal threatening suburban harmony. HOA, in contrast, stood quietly with her hands folded, then calmly recounted everything that had happened, from the unauthorized spa invasion to the compost tub splash, and simply asked the room, would you rather be led by someone who listens, or someone who yells until she thinks she's right? When she stepped down from the podium, there was a moment of silence, then applause, real applause. Not from just the skunk fans or the quiet allies, from everyone who had quietly hoped someone would finally put an end to the madness. The vote took place the next day. The results were posted that evening. HOA won her seat by a landslide. Karen's entire proposal to restructure the board was rejected outright. None of her candidates received more than 5 votes, 2 of which were her own and, presumably, her cousins by mail. Karen didn't show up to the announcement. Word spread that she'd taken a wellness retreat to recalibrate. Her sidewalk table vanished. Her flyers disappeared. And the pastel banner that once read "Stop the Skunk Sanctuary" was last seen stuffed into her recycling bin, soggy and forgotten. As for HOA, she didn't celebrate with fanfare. She celebrated by getting back to work. She met with the board, helped draft clear guidelines for property boundaries and environmental protections, and set up a new seasonal event, Neighborhood Nature Day, a community celebration of urban wildlife, local flora, and shared green spaces. Pepper, naturally, was the honorary mascot. And as HOA stood beside his pen, watching children laugh and seniors ask questions with genuine curiosity, she felt something deeper than victory. She felt peace. The war had never really been about animals or bylaws. It had been about who would shape the soul of the neighborhood for and control, or understanding and respect. And on that front, the answer was finally clear. For a little while, peace felt real. The kind that settled into the bones of the neighborhood, not the kind declared in board meetings or stuck to light poles with cheap tape. The sidewalk where Karen once campaigned now sat blissfully empty. free of pastel propaganda and unsolicited tea samples. The whole meetings had returned to mundane squabbles over fence heights and seasonal wreath regulations, and in the soft hum of this newfound calm, HOA began building. Not just new enclosures or compost bins, but bridges between neighbors, between generations, between people and the wild creatures they once feared. Neighborhood Nature Day had become more than an event. It was a declaration of shared space, of mutual respect. Children were learning not to scream when they saw a skunk but to pause and understand. Retirees volunteered to plant native herbs. Even the local school sent a science club once a month to observe Pepper, now comfortably retired as a community celebrity. For the first time since moving in, HOA allowed herself to exhale. But deep down, she knew Karen wasn't finished. Not really. Her silence had stretched too long, and Karen's brand of silence wasn't surrender. It was suspense. The first sign was subtle. A delivery truck stopped in front of Karen's house on a Thursday afternoon, the driver glancing around nervously before leaving a nondescript brown package on her porch. No one saw Karen retrieve it, but later, as HOA walked past with Pepper tucked in his travel pouch on their way to a vet checkup, she noticed the box still sitting there, hours later, and opened. A small label on the side read, "Organic Skunk Repellent Kit Enhanced Formula, Peppermint and Citrus." HOA stopped, blinked, and nearly laughed aloud. The same peppermint scent that had triggered the now legendary Spa Day disaster was back. This time weaponized in a bottle labeled "Natural Solution to Neighborhood Invaders." It was irony in cardboard form, but more than that, it was a signal. Karen hadn't moved on, she was regrouping again, and sure enough, a week later, the first passive-aggressive ripple hit the surface. It came not in a knock, but in a whisper. A neighbor mentioned offhand that Karen had been attending private HOA advisory sessions with a small, hand-picked group, none of whom were elected, but all of whom shared her flair for drama and her disdain for skunks. Just concerned citizens, they called themselves. They didn't post in forums anymore. They didn't hang flyers. They emailed directly, quickly, consistently planting seeds of doubt. Was HOA's garden too close to the property line? Were the enclosures really up to code? What if one of the skunks escaped? What about the scent? Was it safe for infants? The questions were laced with just enough plausible concern to avoid outright dismissal. But HOA saw the fingerprints all over them. Karen was trying a new tactic: erosion. Not of laws or rules, but of trust. But this time, HOA wasn't just a quiet homeowner. She was now the environmental and boundary liaison. She had a seat at the table and she planned to use it. When Karen's group submitted a formal request for reevaluation of private wildlife structures, HOA didn't flinch. She invited a state environmental officer to walk the grounds. She documented every measurement, every log, every animal ID tag. The officer, same one from last year, smiled when he saw Pepper. Still the neighborhood hero, huh? He chuckled, scratching the old skunk gently under the chin. HOA smiled, but her jaw was tight. They're trying to make this about the animals again. It never was. The officer nodded. I'll write the report. It'll be clean. Clean it was. And yet, the campaign escalated. Karen never appeared in person, but her presence was felt in anonymous HOA tip boxes, in vague emails signed "a friend of the community," and in the sudden surge of conversations about how far was too far when it came to personal projects. One night, HOA returned home to find a printed flyer wedged into her fence slat. No name, no signature, just the bold title, "When Will Enough Be Enough?" and an ominous stock photo of a snarling skunk, mouth open in mid-hiss. HOA ripped it in half and tossed it into the compost bin without a second thought. But inside, something flared. Not fear, not even anger, just a fierce, steady resolve. She'd thought this would end when Karen lost the vote, when the flyers stopped, when the laughter finally drowned out the yelling. But some people didn't know how to lose. They only knew how to wait and poison the ground from below. So HOA changed tactics. She stopped playing defense. She hosted another open garden tour, but this time with a twist, a transparency walk. Each visitor received a pamphlet detailing her permits, her enclosures, her inspection history. There was a QR code linking to a public database of registered wildlife facilities. Pepper and Marshmallow napped beneath a hand-painted sign that read, "Respect begins with clarity." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud, but it sent a message: you can't twist what's already in the light. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of neighbors showed up, some who had never even spoken to HOA before. One elderly man quietly asked if the skunks could help with his slug problem. Another whispered that his granddaughter had stopped being afraid of animals entirely since the last event. And just like that, the whispers shifted, away from fear, toward admiration. Karen's efforts fizzled not with a bang, but with a yawn. Her advisory group faded into irrelevance. Her repellent box was never used. Eventually, it appeared at the community yard sale, marked down to 50 cents. No one bought it. And in the golden hush of dusk 1 week later, Ho stood beside the newly expanded enclosure, watching the skunks shuffle through soft moss and native herbs. Pepper paused beside her, lifted his nose to the breeze, and let out a sound that almost resembled a sigh. "Me too," she whispered. "Me too." Valuable lesson. Sometimes, the most powerful way to defend what you love isn't through shouting matches or spectacle, it's through patience, clarity, and quiet, and wavering truth. In a world where noise often drowns out reason, it's easy to be intimidated by those who manipulate fear, twist narratives, and try to control through chaos. But true strength lies in calm resilience, by standing firm, staying honest, and refusing to stoop to the level of those who bully and bluster. You allow truth to shine through. Respect, whether for nature, boundaries, or each other, isn't just something we demand, it's something we model. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't a fight, it's a garden full of peace, and a community that finally learns to listen.